Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair Younus, and typically we do our podcasts on the weekend. And I was hoping to cover sort of regional developments in the aftermath of the Israeli airstrikes on Doha sometime in the next few days. But as it turns out, events have overrun my own timeline, and now we had to do a special episode. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you know my guest here, and you're familiar with him. Kamran Bokhari joins us. Kamran is somebody who's been on the podcast on many occasions, and one of the people I've been talking to about to understand what is it that the Trump administration sees as new regional security architectures and its own understanding of what, for example, the Europeans should do, the Japanese should do, the Saudis and the Arabs should do in terms of lifting their own capacity to manage their own security environment in the region. If you haven't listened to those conversations, I encourage you to do that because it's a very important backdrop in terms of the framing and the way in which Kamran has been thinking about it. And he joins us again today because we've had in my view at least, and we'll get Kamran's view on this, a major regional development in the sense that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have signed a mutual defense agreement. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. But up first, Kamran, welcome once again to Pakistanomy, and thank you for taking out the time on short notice.
Always a pleasure.
Let's jump into this. You've been talking about sort of over the course of the last 2 years, writing about and talking about what's going on in the Middle East and sort of the need for a emerging security architecture and a new framework. Um, Clearly that framework is now emerging. And at least as far as I can see it, the main trigger of what just transpired between Riyadh and Islamabad were the Israeli strikes on Doha. But how do you see this development, and more importantly, the timing of this development? Because again, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan go way back in terms of security and military cooperation. And something like this has been in the works for years. You can go back to the Rahil Sharif era, etc., as well. But how do you see this, and how do you see the timing of this development?
You're absolutely right, Uzair. This has been a long time in the making. So one can go back as far as shortly after the Arab Spring, circa 2013, and former President Assad of Syria had used chemical weapons against his people. The Obama administration were going to conduct airstrikes. Everything was set. And then at the last moment, the Obama administration decided not to do it because that was part of the conversation to get the Iran nuclear deal going. And so they worked with the Russians to take out or remove some of that stockpile of chemical weapons. But that angered the Saudis very much so. And you can even go back to the Iraq War 10 years earlier in 2003. The Saudis were telling the United States, don't do this because this will basically, Iran is contained. If you remove Saddam, uh, this will be an open playground for the Iranians to play all sorts of geopolitical games. They already had a presence in Syria and Lebanon, and you would be giving them a contiguous sphere of influence stretching to the Eastern Med. The Americans didn't listen, and that sort of soured the relationship. But what it also told the Saudis was that, we need to be thinking about our own security. But as you know, and everyone knows that Saudi Arabia, despite its immense petroleum wealth, has not developed military capabilities of its own and relied more or less on the United States for its security. As time went by, going back to the 2013 incident, the Saudis began to think of unilateral moves. 2 years later, we have the intervention in Yemen, the ill-fated intervention in Yemen. If you recall, Pakistan was asked to join that intervention. This was during the second term of the PMLN. Nawaz Sharif was prime minister, and former Army Chief General Rahil Sharif was leading the military at the time. And it led to a very uncomfortable conversation between the Pakistanis and the Saudis, with the Pakistanis saying, trying to politely sort of wiggle their way out of this difficult situation that the Saudi ask had put them into. So
Going to
they basically
parliament,
said,
Nawaz famously going to parliament and sort of saying, my own parliament does not approve of what you're trying to do here.
and he took, a significantly, gathering or constellation of generals with him, including the DGMO at the time, and to explain to the Saudis as to one of the reasons why Pakistan cannot spare any troops is because they're all very much plugged in, because we can't pull forces out of the eastern border with India, and we have this war going on with the TTP on the Western Front, and we just don't even have the capacity.
And just for historical reference for people who may not fully know those events, because you and I and others who are sort of in the weeds know this, but this was intervention in Yemen was the now Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's pet project. So there is a legacy here of the leadership level as well.
Exactly. I mean, this was one of the first things that he wanted to do, and say, sort of do a game changer. But look, that moment passed, and we're now again 10 years out. A lot has changed. And I think what has been happening is that the major driver of this Saudi move is because the United States has basically made it clear that it's not going to do the heavy lifting of security responsibility in any region. You and I have talked about how the Europeans were shocked with this. They're coming to terms with it because they thought that, well, there's NATO and there's always going to be the United States. The Saudis thought that, hey, in 1945, President FDR and the founder of the modern kingdom, King Abdulaziz, signed an agreement, and that was meant to last. But it's not lasting, and that shift really had the Saudis, thinking about alternatives. So if you're the Saudis, what do? You don't have military capabilities of your own. You tried to demonstrate, or at least try your hand on, beyond the borders power projection capability in Yemen. It did not go well. And so then who are your choices? I mean, Egypt is not what it used to be. Egypt is actually financially dependent on the Saudis and the Emiratis for its own well-being. And the military just can't operate that way, or at least in the way it used to do back in the days of Nasser and Sadat. So what does that leave you with? You have the Turks or the Pakistanis. The Turks, bring back old memories of the Ottoman Empire. Mind you, it was the Saudis who rebelled against the Ottoman Empire and founded, what was at the time a small emirate, and eventually, over time, it became a Saudi polity, in the sense that we know it today. So, if you don't want to do the Turks, who is left? It's the Pakistanis. And with Pakistan, you have a really good relationship. Pakistan relies on you for a lot of things. You have relied on Pakistan for, military support, even though Pakistan did not engage or, participate in the Yemen war. But Pakistan has been, providing for security all throughout. I mean, in the 1991 Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, a sizable number of Pakistani military personnel were stationed in the kingdom. And this is a long-standing tradition. So now you need to formalize it. So the Saudis have now formalized it and basically said, look, we know you need help and we need help too. You have a military force and we don't. But we do have financial, if you will, bandwidth, and we have oil. And so I think what we have is the making of a deal. The details are still, murky. It's very early on. They'll trickle in, as they always do. But this is significant. This is significant. It comes at a time when Iran is not the threat that it used to be for the Saudis. But there is a new Israel, Israel that is not only seeking a strategic depth in the Palestinian territories, but is also projecting power beyond them. So they've created a buffer zone in Syria. They are striking the Houthis in Yemen. They have, launched direct attacks against Israel. They're trying to maintain some sort of a presence in southern Lebanon. Remains to be seen what happens there. And then the Qatar strike. And so that's the moment in which this is happening. But I think that this is beyond the current moment. I think this is a very long-term thing that the Saudis need, because ultimately, if the United States is not going to be there, then the Saudis need friends who can help them with regional security. Now, what will Pakistan's responsibilities be? How many troops get stationed in the kingdom? What will their role be? These are all things that we will learn in due course of time. But this is major. This is like, South Asia and the Middle East coming together in a very unusual way.
I want to also talk about something that's also come up since the attack on Qatar, the Israeli attack on Qatar, right? Which is that a lot of the conversation that I've picked up on from Gulf experts, analysts, some extent media, as well, is that, hey, like we need a lot more of this kind of support and agreements. And I found it interesting that in the run up to even the sort of broader OIC meeting, Netanyahu had started sort of targeting Pakistan, and there was this famous exchange now on at the UN as well between the Israeli ambassador to the UN and the Pakistani ambassador to the UN. And from what I've picked up on is that there could be potential other partners, maybe Qatar, maybe the UAE. We know there's some activity going on in Syria with the support of the Saudis and the Turks, and with Pakistan and the new Syrian regime there. Do you see this expanding in the coming weeks and months in terms of moving towards a broader, at least at the GCC level, security architecture where Pakistan emerges as perhaps a net security provider to all of those countries?
Yes, I mean, look, right now, ideally, all things being equal, the Saudis would like to have sort of a collective security arrangement for the region. Ideally, there should be that Islamic military alliance that they created to for counterterrorism purposes, to fighting Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Iranian-backed groups. So the threat was Iran. It was called the Islamic Military Alliance, and till this day, former Pakistani Army Chief General Raheel Sharif is the commander of that organization. It does not have any troops, to my knowledge, but 41 members, 41 nations, Arabs and Muslims, are part of that, formally part of that entity. It's been inactive. It doesn't look like it's a security organization. It more looks like a dialogue forum, if you will. But that sort of, that was one thing that could have been sort of activated. But it's hard. I mean, look, putting together military organizations, multinational military organizations, is not easy. In recent memory, there were only two organizations, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which were a Cold War phenomenon. The Warsaw Pact obviously existed until the collapse of the Soviet Union or just before it. Uh, NATO still exists. But NATO exists because it was easy for all the Europeans and the Canadians and the Turks and others to basically follow the American lead. In any military organization, the basic problem is which country, will be leading the effort. And so this is about sovereignty. This is about, no nation would want to sort of subordinate itself to others. It was very unique what happened in NATO because of the Soviet threat, because of the post-World War II situation, the dependency. It was very clear it was going to be America or nothing. In this case, it's very hard. So Ideally, which countries can provide troops and have major militaries? Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey have large militaries. Saudi Arabia has a considerable military, but it's not what you would call a very experienced military in terms of active combat. So it's nowhere near what the Egyptians have, certainly not what the Turks or the Pakistanis have. So you can't have an organization just yet. It takes time. There are so many things that have to be sorted out. Uh, so in the meantime, what do? You do a bilateral thing. And like I said, Pakistan was the obvious choice. There are things that the Saudis can provide to the Pakistanis in exchange for which the Pakistanis can provide, be that net security guard. But ultimately, you're right. There will be others joining, but it's going to be interesting to watch. I mean, one of the things that we've been hearing, at least in the media, is that the Iranians are interested in being part of a collective security arrangement. Obviously, that is not going to work because of history and because the Iranians are arch rivals of the Saudis, and there's mutual mistrust, deep mutual mistrust. But we have the brother of MBS, the Crown Prince, Khalid bin Salman, KBS, who's the defense minister of Saudi Arabia. He met with the new national security chief just yesterday in Riyadh. In fact, not him, but his brother as well, according to the reports. MBS himself met Ali Larijani from
Yeah.
Iran. But it's going to be hard. How do you bring all these countries into a collective security organization, even at the GCC level? Mind you, that there was what one would call some police action that the Saudis led in Bahrain in the year of the Arab Spring. So, if my memory serves me, the Saudis were leading. There were UAE forces, and there were some forces from Qatar that crossed the causeway, went in, and tag teamed with the Bahraini security forces to put down the agitation there against the monarchy, the Arab Spring agitation. That was a small police action, if you will. That was the most that we could have seen from a GCC level, operation. What we're talking here is much bigger. It requires a military that's very experienced in combat. This is tradecraft. I mean, this isn't sort of like an intellectual exercise. This is the real deal. You have either you know the tradecraft and you can execute on it, or you don't. Pakistan is one of those countries that is battle hardened, its military forces, and ample amount of experience. They know what to do. So for now, it's Pakistan, but others can join in. We'll see, uh, where does this extend? Does this limit itself to the Saudi kingdom? Perhaps in the initial years. But there's this question. Okay, so once the war in Gaza ends and Hamas's government is gone, nobody wants Israeli military to occupy that country. The Israeli military chief is saying, we don't want to occupy this place. So then who will provide security? I suspect that it will be a coalition of Arab Muslim forces. We'll see. But there's so many areas. I mean, Syria is another area where you already have Turkish troops there, 20,000 at least, if not more. And then, it's beefing up capacity. So what the Turks are trying to do is build up the new military establishment of this new Syrian regime. That's going to take time. So this is a very long-term project. I mean, we can easily talk about the next 10 years because it does take that much time to get things running.
So related to this, again, I was reading some of the text that was made public in terms of the signing of this pact, and the operative sort of sentence that stood out to me basically was that the agreement states that any aggression against either country shall be considered an aggression against both. How do you see this? Because from my perspective, again, as you laid out, if the Iranians and the Saudis are improving relations and talking about moving past history to a certain degree, and yes, there's like mistrust there, and that always be there for a long time. Um, so Iran is almost like a force in check and trying to play ball with the Arabs. The Syrians and the Iraqis are a shadow of their former selves in terms of the threat that Saddam perhaps once represented, or Bashar al-Assad and his regime represented. That leaves basically Israel as and the current sort of archetype of the greater Israel project that they're embarking on and bombing. Last I counted, like 8 to 9 countries around the world in the last few weeks alone, and then Doha and Qatar itself. Um, what does this paragraph tell you about where things stand? Because again, from the conversations I've had with Pakistan, well, they say, well, this type of aggression on Pakistan was India a few weeks ago. And so therefore the Saudis have really come out in the open in terms of where they will stand in future such conflicts. And then on the Saudi side, it's like, hey, is Israel really going to attack Saudi Arabia anytime soon? Like, I don't know what this is about. So how do you see this sort of language in the agreement?
Great question. So clearly, we asked the question, if there are, stakeholders in any venture, each stakeholder is asking, what's in it for me? So, and that depends on what they need. So, what is the need of Pakistan? The need of Pakistan is, well, we just had an unprecedented 87-hour war with India in May. We don't know when it will happen again. We have to assume it will happen again. We, did well this time. We may not do well next time. And had this war gone on longer than 87 hours, maybe things could have taken a turn for the worse. So there are gaps in Pakistan's capabilities. And the big question is always, and this is something that has been recently openly debated in the Pakistani media as well. How long can you put up a fight? And this is predates the May, post Pahalgam mini war. So what you need is, what is Pakistan's weakness? The weakness is Pakistan is cash strapped. And so what can Saudi Arabia do for Pakistan? It obviously cannot send forces because if it had forces, then it wouldn't be in this arrangement with Pakistan to begin with. So one can assume that the Saudis will, if one gets attacked, both gets attacked. And so what role would the Saudis play? I would suspect financial assistance. I would suspect, oil facilities, diplomatic support, et cetera, et cetera. And so, uh, so again, this isn't sort of the classic NATO article, that you invoke Article 5, hey, we were attacked, and therefore, everybody needs to sort of come to the aid. I don't think it's going to happen in that classic sense. So it'll happen, if let's say Pakistan had goes into a conflict with India again, then it's reasonable to assume that this is what the Saudis will be doing, providing that kind of support. So that's in it for Pakistan. Now, in terms of Saudi Arabia, well, Iran is not in a position anymore to cause trouble. It's in its interest to actually play ball with the Arab states, given its other difficulties and whatnot, with Turkey, with the Americans, with the Israelis. So that's not a threat. Um, do they face a threat from Israel? Not directly. I find it hard to believe that Israel would, you know, strike directly at Saudi Arabia. I think that even what happened in Qatar is would not have happened had there not been Hamas people there. Otherwise, there's no reason. Why would you attack? What's there to attack? You need a reason to attack. So I don't see a reason for why Israel would suddenly, at some point in the future, attack Saudi Arabia. In fact, it's the opposite. They've been wanting the Saudis to join the Abraham Accords. They still want that. But what's happening is the Israelis are expanding strategic depth and they're looking for strategic autonomy. They no longer want to be, so they're willing to incur a great deal of international opprobrium, criticism, but they want to be able to secure the state of Israel. And how do you do it is by saying, well, there will not be a Palestinian state. Netanyahu has said this many times. He just said it the other day as well. In fact, I think, if I'm not wrong, I recall that that joint press conference with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he repeated it in that press conference as well. So if that is the case, so if there's not going to be a Palestinian state, because the Israelis are going to have long-term control, influence over Gaza. Same thing with, West Bank. That means that there's going to be trouble spilling over because this is something that uh, Saudis and the others cannot accept because it creates all sorts of problems. Plus, you're pushing for strategic depth in Syria, in Lebanon. And the Saudis cannot control Yemen. Ideally, they wouldn't want the Houthis to go attack the Israelis and have that clash. But this is their southern flank, the Saudi southern flank. So it's not the direct attack, but it's regional instability. And that has me wondering that is this just about defending the kingdom, or is it about defending the kingdom's interests in the region? And what does that entail? You're muted.
Sorry about that. If I were to go back in history, then as you laid this out, it's almost like, back in the day when the Pakistani armed forces defended the interests of the Jordanian kingdom back in the day around Black September and the clearance ops there, or helped defend the interests of the Syrians back in the day during, we know that Pakistani Air Force officers used to fly the Syrian jets back in the day as well, and work together with them, etc. So that could be there's a model for that. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one match, but that would be a pretty interesting sort of shift in regional dynamics. Suffice to say, however way in which this plays out, basically it would be fair to argue that a part of the security architecture or umbrella that now extends over the Arabian Peninsula, so to speak, um, is going to be provided by Pakistan. That then firmly places Pakistan in the Middle Eastern area of operation, so to speak, which brings me to my question, second to last question for you, which is, would this have happened in a environment where the United States did not give its blessing or was not privy to the fact that something like this was going to move forward between Riyadh and Islamabad? Or do you think this is part of the entire wave of engagement Pakistan has had with Donald Trump and his administration? The Saudis have had with the Trump administration, and now this, because again, there's a lot of talk about the fact that in the next few days, Shabazz Sharif may meet Donald Trump in New York. And so, how do you see the US role here?
It's a great question. The simple answer is uh, I don't know of a universe in which the Saudis and the Pakistanis went ahead with this without checking with the Americans. So I'm not saying it's blessed. Or sort of, to what degree, I don't know to what degree they discussed this before they went ahead with it. But if you have close relations, uh, the Saudis do with the Americans, the Pakistanis also, and the Pakistanis are trying to improve their relationship in the wake of, everything that's happened since President Trump came to office. It's hard to see that they just did this without actually consulting. And it also leads me to the other point that this is, in many ways, what the Trump White House, what Washington wants. Regional stakeholders taking the lead for security in their regions. Now, having said that, the way in which the Americans envisioned this was Turkey has relations with Israel. They need to improve. The Saudis have to join the Abraham Accords. And then it would be this three-way thing: Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, plus Arab states dealing with security of the region, relieving the United States of that responsibility. This becomes a bit more complicated. A, Israel is not part of this, and relations, and we're moving in the direction opposite to the Abraham Accords, given what's going on. So that's not comforting for Washington. Second of all, notice how in the last several weeks, I would say, if not, 6 weeks maybe, we have the Trump White House actually pulling Pakistan into U.S. Central Command. My understanding is that one way of keeping sort of balance between India and Pakistan is to sort of say, well, we want you, Pakistan, we need you in Central Command, AOR. India, we already renamed Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. Now we know, things haven't been great, and that's going to be a work long in progress, but that's what the division is. So, there's sort of that overlap. So I'm thinking that what is the U.S. Central Command AOR? It's the Middle East plus Central Asia and a little bit of the northwestern Indian Ocean basin. So Pakistan, the U.S. needs Pakistan to help with Afghanistan, to help with Central Asia, and I have to believe that they also want them to help out with Middle East. Did they want them to help out in this way with a bilateral security agreement? I'm not so sure. But there's what you want and what you can have, and this is true for all actors, big and small. So I see sort of that wrinkle there. And again, ideally, the architecture should have had in Israel with it. That's not happening. But this is happening between on a bilateral level, and soon it could go to a multilateral level. We don't know how soon, and we don't know in what shape or form. So, it's in some ways it's playing out to how the Trump White House wants things to go because they clearly don't want to be paying or be responsible for security, in the Middle East or in Europe.
Well, in the bilateral sense, also, it could also be a almost like in how international trade is now working, which is a web of free trade agreements at the bilateral level, right? So there might be a mutual agreement between Saudi and Pakistan, and down the road, a similar mutual agreement between Qatar and Pakistan. And therefore, it doesn't have to be a multilateral thing, but Pakistan works with both sides on the bilateral basis to then coordinate and do whatever is necessary in that regional emerging architecture. And maybe the UAE also at some point decides to join. I would argue, rather, because like in international trade as well, multilateral trade agreements are much more painful. So if you create a web of bilateral free trade agreements, it works the same way with a lot more ease at the bilateral level. So maybe that's another way to look at it. My last question to you then is, you mentioned like Pakistan is cash strapped, and that's where Saudis come in, diplomatically come in. Saudi need military capability. That's where Pakistan comes in. One thing I'm also thinking about in the context of this, and given there's a history of this as well, which is that in the last few years now, increasingly, Pakistan has been cut out of the American defense procurement architecture for obvious reasons, because the United States wants to court India as its one of the major customers, and you can't do business with both, obviously speaking. So Pakistan has gone towards the Chinese platforms, and we've seen that in the recent war with India. But Saudi Arabia still relies heavily on and is a major buyer of American, state-of-the-art American equipment. From the Pakistani side, do you also see this as a potential advantage of this type of mutual defense pact where you kind of get access to all of the good old toys of the United States and get to play with them through the Saudi angle in a way that perhaps also gives you exposure about the capabilities that the Indians down the road may start acquiring from the United States? Because again, we've seen this in Qatar with the Rafale training of the Pakistani Air Force pilots, which the Indians did not like at that point. So, how do you see this as well as a potential strategy to say, hey, we're cut out formally of the out of the platforms that the Americans have, but they do give it to the Saudis, and this way we also get eyes and our hands on these toys that perhaps our rival may also get down the road.
That's a great point. Yeah, I do see it happening that way. Um, as long as the Americans don't put restrictions on the Saudis, I'm not privy or aware of any at this point in time. But I think you're right. Look, there is that element of, okay, so there's the obvious, hey, I need you when I'm having problems with India. And we're with you for, this regional security architecture in the Middle East. So that's one level of it. But this is sort of that secondary level where, okay, I ca- I gain access to technology that I otherwise would not have. But the Saudis can afford it, and the Americans are willing to sell it to the Saudis. So, if the Pakistanis are going to be big players in the Saudi security establishment or the Saudi national security space, then obviously that's not going to be a separate, if you will, parallel track where there will be, access to hardware. And because you can't, I mean, there's just, you can't sort of divide that up that say, okay, only help us in this, but don't help us in that. I mean, there's one more thing I want to bring up, which is that if Pakistan becomes a big player for Middle Eastern security, and I say if because it hasn't happened yet, that is huge because there are very few countries in the world that have deployed multi-divisional forces beyond their borders. I mean, this is something that America does. The Soviets did it. The Chinese have not done it
Yeah, I was
so
gonna
far.
say too, so far they haven't done that yet.
They haven't done that. So this puts Pakistan in a different league. So imagine being, a core element. I mean, this is about projecting military power. The most that has happened, I mean, in the good old days, we used to have, the blue helmets, the UN peacekeeping troops. Again, a multinational force, but it was for peacekeeping. And that's where Pakistan has a lot of experience. You mentioned Jordan in 1970. And so, yes, this is, I think, this would be huge for Pakistan in terms of being able to be a country that operates militarily, obviously with allies, under the aegis of the Saudis, but being, having projecting power in a sense beyond your borders. And so that's huge. That would be sort of the next level. And uh, the implications of this, I can't even begin to sort of unpack them because there's so many. Because we're looking at a long-term commitment. And so what follows from that, and then how does that improve Pakistan's security? I mean, the thing that we haven't talked about is this would require Pakistan to raise forces, because you just can't pull forces from here and there because they're all sort of accounted for. And Pakistan has security problems on its western flank, on its eastern flank, and of course, there's the Iranian border as well. So Pakistan would have to sort of augment its current capabilities in terms of manpower. So this is quite the thing. I mean, it needs to be thought out more fully, and I think that's probably what we're going to be doing, both you and I and our many other colleagues, in the days and months ahead.
Yeah, no, this was going to be my last question, which is, we're talking about this maybe 6 or 7 hours after the announcement came out, so it's very new. There hasn't been even a full day of coverage out of Pakistan or Saudi Arabia on this or reporting on exactly what is even beyond the statement that has been issued, like things that will get disclosed over time. So from your perspective, again, as you say, this is something you will monitor in the next few days and weeks to come. What are some things you're going to be keeping an eye out on in terms of assessing what this really means? Because again, for the audience, I want you to leave them with some nuggets of things they should be tracking to sort of build their own understanding of where this goes.
And so it's details, details, details. I mean, we need more details. So how big of a force? What will their responsibility be? Who will be paying for them? Where will they be deployed? What will that, uh, how long of an endeavor this is? Obviously, we talked about raising this force that will be deployed somewhere. Where will it be deployed? You know, is it going to be on the Yemeni border? Is it going to be on the Jordanian border? Is it going to patrol, the coastal areas in the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf? Will this deployment, morph into task forces that will be sent into places like Syria, for example? Just throwing it out there. I have no idea whether this is ever going to happen, but these are the kind of things we need to think about. We also need to see what will be the American reaction. We need to see what will be the Indian reaction. India has a very strong economic relationship with the GCC countries. We have to see, how Iran reacts to this. What are the Turks thinking? I mean, all things being equal, they have their hands full and they could use some help from outside. And so, there are all sorts of unknowns right now. It'll be fun to watch.
Yeah, most definitely. And we will have you back on the podcast as more details come out. But again, I think you and I are in agreement that this is a major inflection point for the region, and obviously for Pakistani Saudi relations. But writ large, it sort of signals a major shift in regional military and security dynamics and will have far reaching repercussions. And so we'll continue focusing on that. I want to thank you for taking out the time late evening here, DC, and appreciate all the insights and analysis. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.